By the early 1950s, Universal Studios had largely given up on its tradition of gothic horror films. Arguably, the last of the line was 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, the greatest of the horror comedies, but nevertheless a farce on the petrified iconography of their classic monsters. Universal's immediate future belonged to atomic age sci fi, including the last great monster, the creature from the Black Lagoon, in 1954. Universal pretty much dropped out of the game in 1960, with its last of what had become little more than B-movie drive-in monsters. Yet at just that same time, hideous things were brewing in England. Hammer Films began production of their own line of horror films that were widely seen as inheriting Universal's mantle. Produced in color and starring legendary actors Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, films like The Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, The Revenge of Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Brides of Dracula proved that there was still interest in well-made, well-acted, well-scripted Gothic horror films. Nevertheless, these were ultimately a string of remakes of Universal's films, or at least their source material. A true heir to Universal's mantle would have to come from an unlikely and homegrown source. American International Pictures was a low-grade B-movie house that was known for giving minuscule shooting schedules and shoestring budgets to films like I Was a Teenage Werewolf and Reform School Girl, both released in 1957. However, when one of their most prolific and reliable directors, Roger Corman, approached them to make their own series of Hammer-style horror films, they gave him the green light. Not only that, but they upped his budget and gave him a whole 15 days to shoot his first, on the gamble that this was just the sort of thing that would raise AIP's standing, not to mention their profit margins. As source material, Corman deviated from the tradition of European writers to go with an American original, Edgar Allan Poe. Richard Matheson, one of the greatest horror writers that ever lived, supplied the script based on Poe's 1839 story, The Fall of the House of Usher. Then came the inspired choice to cast Vincent Price as Roderick Usher. To this point, Price was already an established actor with 20 years of experience and over 80 roles in his filmography. He originally entered the craft as a dramatic character actor who took on a number of historical dramas, then transitioning into noir thrillers for a while. In the 50s, he really began his career in horror, in such films as House of Wax in 1953, The Fly in 1958, and Return of the Fly in 1959, and The House on Haunted Hill and The Tingler for William Castle, both in 1959. Over the course of his career, less than a third of Price's films were horror, but they were the ones with the most enduring popularity, cementing him as a horror icon. This was due in no small part to AIP's Poe cycle. Together, Corman, Matheson, and Price created House of Usher in 1960 and charted a new course in American horror film that was, in my opinion, the true heir to Universal Studios. When it comes to Gothic horror, one could very easily make the argument that it needs to be in black and white or it's not worth doing. The lack of color strengthens the sense of the sublime, deepening shadow and vivifying light, and today adding an implicit patina of age. In the 60s, however, black and white didn't give an elegant sense of vintage maturity. It was merely old and cheap. If you wanted to show you were tapped into the day, you had to make a film in splashy Technicolor. To compensate, Corman decided to go overboard. If one were to pick a single word to describe the colors and sets in his Poe films, it would be lurid. The outside of a high Gothic manor on a hill may be dark and brooding, but is under a lurid sky, or, in the case of House of Usher, surrounded by a lurid green mist. The house is filled with quintessential spooky stuff, cobwebs and stone corridors and the like, but otherwise overindulges color by painting the walls in vividly lurid tones. Corman's Poe films are all purples and reds and greens, with smatterings of blues and orange. Lurid is not only an appropriate adjective for the sets, but also for the scripts. House of Usher is a rarity in the Poe cycle for actually bearing some strong resemblance to the story on which it is based. Some later films merely used a Poe poem as a jumping off point for some fever dream. A few only attached the profitable Poe name to a movie adapting work by an entirely different author. As the first of these films, House of Usher manages to hew closely to the outline of the original story, despite Poe's brand of melancholy badness and oppressive gloom not necessarily fitting with the formula adhered to by AIP's studio head Samuel Z. Arkoff. The so-called Arkoff formula was action, revolution, killing, oratory, fantasy, and fornication. Thus House of Usher was less of a careful study of a man's descent into madness, and more yelling and punching and running and fighting and things exploding and fire and whatnot. American International's House of Usher was a surprise hit for the company. Corman knew it would be a success, but not to the extent it was, as the perfect, lurid, gaudy, brash drive-in movie fare. Word came down from on high that another movie adapting Edgar Allan Poe was required, preferably starring Vincent Price and written by Richard Matheson. There was no concept of a series of Poe films yet, but 1961's The Pit and the Pendulum became the model for what would come. Whereas House of Usher followed the original story relatively closely, The Pit and the Pendulum deviates wildly. According to Corman, our method was to use the Poe short story as the climax for the third act of the motion picture, because a 2-page short story is not about to give you a 90-minute motion picture, quote unquote. So here we have the titular torture device reserved for the dramatic climax, with a wholly original lead-up drafted by Matheson. To concoct this script, Matheson and Corman collaborated on what they felt were some of the common underlying ideas and themes of Poe. Consequently, they created a standard template for their Poe films. The main plot thread they unearthed is the idea of premature burial. Usually it involves a victim who was not dead, whether they were buried unwittingly or as a deliberate part of a nefarious scheme. If the victim actually is dead when they are buried, then at the very least they are the unquiet dead. Either way, be it a not quite dead wife, or a dead but back for revenge wife, or an ancient family ghost, or what have you, the dominant theme is things that are buried which refuse to stay buried. This directly symbolizes Poe's psychological themes as an excavation of dark subconscious forces. It is reflected in the character with something to hide that does not remain hidden, as well as the dead that refuse to stay that way. Perhaps they are mentally ill and fighting off some morbid fascination, or perhaps they are a lying conspirator out to get someone killed. And generally, what they are trying to hide is the body in the cellar. Eventually, what is lying in their subconscious will become exposed. In The Pit and the Pendulum, a young Englishman arrives at the castle of the Medinas in 16th century Spain, looking to learn the truth behind the death of his sister, who married the head of the household. Don Medina is the son of one of the most sadistic of the Spanish inquisitors, who once murdered his brother and tortured his adulterous wife nearly to death before breaking her up in the family crypt. Don Medina witnessed the whole thing as a boy, leading to an adulthood marked by morbid fear of having buried his own wife alive after she died of fright. The fact that he can hear her voice calling to him and the harpsichord playing mysteriously in the night isn't helping matters very much. So, is it Don Medina that has some dark secret to be uncovered? Or is something else going on in that malodorous manner? Will the Englishman find out more than he wanted to? Is there even something deeper and more horrific in Don Medina's subconscious? Do the dead stay buried? The Pit and the Pendulum was another smash success, and Corman was gearing up for a third when a dispute with AIP led him to take up his ball and go to another company. He found a suitable producer in Europe's Pathé, though it led to a number of alterations in the formula that he had now established. Neither Vincent Price nor Richard Matheson were available, what with their being under contract to AIP. Consequently, Corman brought on Charles Beaumont as a writer and Ray Milland as lead actor on an outing that otherwise had all the same quintessentially Corman Poe-ish stuff. AIP, however, wasn't about to let a cash cow go without a fight. When he found out about this arrangement, Samuel Arkoff flew to Europe and essentially blackmailed Pathé into selling the production back to AIP. Once more, Corman was under an AIP contract and adding another official entry into the series of Poe movies. It took getting rid of Price and Matheson to show how the series hit its stride and figured out what it does well. Milland excels in the Vincent Price role, bringing a dignity to it that Price himself would not have been able to bring. It's easy enough to imagine how Price would have acted out the role, and it would have been great in its own right. Nevertheless, Milland is very well cast as the quiet aristocrat trying desperately to restrain his mortifying terror of being buried alive. The spooky stuff is all there and all in order. The movie begins with an exhumation in an eerie, fog-enshrouded cemetery, and there are ample crypts and cobwebbed corridors and a stunning nightmare sequence. Given that Corman's Poe movies dwell morbidly on the theme of premature burial and the unquiet dead, of secrets and spirits that refuse to stay hidden, the premature burial is its purest distillation, and one of my most favorite films of the series. It was so emblematic of the series that when Corman reunited with Price and Matheson, they had nothing left to do and attempted to branch out. 1962's Tale of Terror marked the fourth film in the cycle and played a bit with the format, opting to anthologize 3 of Poe's stories. It also introduced a new element that would later produce one of the best films of the series: comedy. Originally, Tales of Terror was set to be as ominous, lurid, and gloomy as the 3 preceding films. Matheson, however, felt they needed to inject a bit of levity to raise the spirits, so to speak, and do something a little different. Thus, the terrifying Morella and the facts in the case of M. Valdemar sandwiched the darkly comic The Black Cat. After an absence on the premature burial, Vincent Price starred in all 3 segments. Whereas he typically acted circles and chewed scenery around his lesser supporting actors, Basil Rathbone in M. Valdemar and Peter Lorre in The Black Cat easily held their own. Price is a charismatic actor whose presence leaps off the screen, but he is at his absolute best when he is the sardonic and witty delivery man of black humor. When paired with Peter Lorre in particular, as the hapless foil, the effect is pure magic, which AIP would sustain for a further 3 films. After a few years, AIP's Poe movies were popular enough that other film companies were keen to try the same formula. In 1962, United Artists hired on both Corman and Price to bring the story of Richard III to lurid life in Tower of London. A year later, Corman departed UA, but Price remained for Twice Told Tales. Opting to steer clear of Poe, United Artists went for another great American author, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Named for Hawthorne's book, only one of this anthology's 3 stories is adapted from it, that being Dr. Heidegger's Experiment. The other 2 are adapted from his other works, Rappaccini's Daughter and The House of the Seven Gables. While Rappaccini's Daughter, about a mad botanist, is a bit of an odd choice, the other 2 segments are spot on for capturing a Poe-like gothic atmosphere. Dr. Heidegger's Experiment is also immeasurably enriched by placing the wonderful Sebastian Cabot opposite Vincent Price. Cabot is probably most famous as the narrator of The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh and as the voice of Bagheera in The Jungle Book. Remaining along with Price is the theme of the unquiet dead. Back under the AIP stable, the regular team joined with Peter Lorre, a very young Jack Nicholson, and horror legend Boris Karloff to produce the company's first full horror comedy, The Raven, in 1963. Most of the humor is derived from the petty-mindedness of the characters in what is supposed to be a brooding horror film, and a lot of zippy bits of dialogue. The Raven was a success, and set off another quasi-series before Corman would settle back down into more straightforward horror films. In fact, the next 3 films in the series technically had nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe at all. Later in 1963, he would adapt the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, under the Poe title, The Haunted Castle, since it was felt that Poe was more marketable. The changes brought about by Corman and Beaumont find a middle ground between Lovecraft and the themes of Corman's Poe series. The quintessential Lovecraftian things are there: Arkham, the Necronomicon, human deformities, insanity-inducing creatures, and mentions of Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth. But so are the Poe series' running meditation on the unquiet dead. H.P. Lovecraft has been notoriously difficult to adapt, as one would expect when the author's dominant theme is that the universe is so terrifying that it would drive humanity into nihilism and insanity to see it. The Haunted Palace does as good a job as can be expected under the circumstances of getting the low-budget Roger Corman treatment. Leftover sets from The Raven were used in an original, but not very good, story called The Terror, starring Karloff and Nicholson, also released in 1963. Finally, right at the start of 1964, director Jacques Tourneur would reassemble Richard Matheson, Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, Boris Karloff, and Basil Rathbone to make one of the best films of the entire series and the climax of horror comedies, The Black Comedy of Terrors. For Matheson, the sameness of the subject matter was still getting under his skin. I was getting tired of writing about people being buried alive, so I decided to make a joke about it, quote unquote. Vincent Price is in peak form as Waldo Turnbull.
Good afternoon, Mr. Turnbull.
Trumbull! Will you learn to pronounce my name correctly?
I said Mr. Turnbull.
A drunk, sardonic scoundrel who married the daughter of old Mr. Hinchley, played by Boris Karloff, to take over his mortuary business.
Shall I give him some medicine?
Peter Lorre plays Felix Gilly, a failed bank robber and lockpicker.
You're probably the most inept housebreaker in all of New England.
That's true.
Who acts as Turnbull's accomplice.
Mr. Turnbull.
Trumbull.
I said Turnbull.
And holds out a torch for Mrs. Amaryllis Turnbull, played by Joyce Jameson.
Oh, don't be like that.
Get away from me.
Unfortunately, the mortuary business is not as lucrative as Turnbull hoped.
Trumbull.
I said Mr. Turnbull.
Forcing him and Gilly to drum up business the old-fashioned way. After one failed attempt where the widow ran off with all the money,
Is there no morality left in this world?
they concoct a plan
To paraphrase the venerable adage, we shall kill 2 birds with 1 pillow.
by offing their landlord, Mr. John F. Black Esquire, played by Basil Rathbone, who has the temerity not to stay dead.
Confound you, sir! Confound you too, sir!
Will you kindly have the goodness to die?
Never!
The cast works perfectly together, with great comedic timing and snappy dialogue.
Oh, good work.
It's a little better in a dog.
What is decapitation? I am afraid, madam, that he has made his final crossing to that Stygian shore.
What?
He's dead.
Unfortunately, Comedy of Terrors is virtually unknown today, and didn't fare very well when it was first released. Audiences didn't catch on to the title, a play on Shakespeare's A Comedy of Errors, and stayed well away from the drive-in when it was playing. Richard Matheson speculated that AIP would have liked to give it a Poe title, but couldn't find anything to latch onto it. As a consequence of its poor box office showing, AIP went back to straight adaptations of Poe. As straight as AIP could do them, of course. Next to be released was The Mask of Red Death in 1964, directed by Corman from a script originally developed by Charles Beaumont. Now, The Mask of Red Death is played very straight, perhaps too straight. The film was no more of a success than Comedy of Terrors, which Arkoff attributed to it being too arty-farty. Rather than another scintillating horror film in the style of so many before, Corman produced a psychological drama about faith, temptation, and debauchery worthy of the Decameron. Price plays Prince Prospero, a satanic disciple who is holding an orgy of food and frivolity within his castle, while the plague of Red Death sweeps the country without. Into his castle he has taken the comely and pious Francesca, her father, and her beau, with the goal of pitting the two men against each other in mortal combat for the amusement of his guests, and to tempt her to the dark side. On the one hand, The Mask of Red Death is another welcome change after the perfection of the Unquiet Dead theme in earlier films. On the other hand, it wanted for quintessentially spooky stuff. The horror is more metaphysical than visceral, bound in the moral dilemmas faced by the characters, rather than cobwebs and crypts and ghouls rising from the grave. So, the next film after Mask of Red Death was The Tomb of Ligeia. Roger Corman's final film in the series was a return to form in more ways than one. It was a return to the theme of the Unquiet Dead, centered on Verdun Fell, played by Vincent Price, whose deceased first wife Ligeia has pledged to will herself back into the living world, which does no favors for his second wife. It was also a return to the more subdued filmmaking of House of Usher, the very first Poe film by Corman. This was also largely helped by location shooting in the English countryside. When filming on location in the 60s, you have to accept what the real world gives you, and it is not the heightened reality of lurid green fog and purple skies. It's just plain reality. The interior sets at Shepperton Studios were also subdued, mostly gray and smattered with Egyptian reproduction artifacts, seemingly designed to make the odd red jacket, carpet, or smear of blood pop out. The Tomb of Ligeia was one of the best of the series by Corman's own reckoning, no doubt because it was played more like a real film than the lurid drive-in schlock he had been making between House of Usher and it. Mileage varies on that account, though, as that lurid drive-in schlock is really entertaining in its own right. If one genuinely enjoys it, The Tomb of Ligeia may seem lacking in many respects. Nevertheless, on Matheson's heels, Corman was done with it by 1964. Vincent Price, for his part, was still well employed by AIP. In 1965, he starred in the title role of Dr. Goldfoot in the Bikini Machine, and would star in the final film in the Poe series to speak of. It's red-headed stepchild, in a sense, a bizarre fusion of the Poe cycle with the Jules Verne-style scientific romances that had been popular since Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 1954. Starring Vincent Price, but directed by Jacques Tourneur and written by Charles Bennett and Lewis M. Hayward, 1965's War Gods of the Deep ostensibly finds its inspiration in the Poe poem The City in the Sea. The connection is even more labored than The Ravens, and owes most of its structure to the common tropes that had been built up around the Jules Verne-type film. The story begins in a murky English coast on a stormy night in 1903, where the ringing of an otherworldly bell announces a body that has mysteriously washed up at the base of the crags beneath a foreboding old inn. The recovered corpse turns out to be the lawyer of the American woman staying at the inn, and so she, an American geologist, and a British artist with a pet hen named Herbert are embroiled in the plot. The artist, incidentally, was played by Mary Poppins' David Tomlinson, whose chicken is a direct descendant of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea's Esmeralda the Seal, and Journey to the Center of the Earth's Gertrude the Duck. Scouring the inn by candlelight, the girl is suddenly abducted through the secret passage behind the bookcase. The only clue to her kidnappers are small piles of seaweed that lead the stalwart and eccentric men, respectively, to the caverns beneath the inn and a whirlpool that drags them into lost Lyonesse, the city in the sea. An ancient, labyrinthine edifice built eons ago by a mysterious race of gillmen from the shallow end of the Creature from the Black Lagoon's gene pool, fed air and power through the advanced technology of thermal vents connected to a nearby volcano. Since then, these gillmen have devolved into pure brutes at the command of Vincent Price and his crew of smugglers who have been trapped in the city for a century. Price himself has designs on the girl, and the gillmen demand blood sacrifices in the stone halls of their Babylonian gods. The set, miniature, and matte work is sublime, and save for a few unfortunate conceptualizations of an underwater volcano, is extremely well done and capable of evoking the feeling of an ancient submerged city. The Gilman costumes are wretched, however, and the Vernian diving suits are interesting but a little awkward. Vincent Price himself is, as always, magisterial, and giving his all to a performance for which legend says he didn't even have the script until days before shooting. After the fever pitch of previous Poe films, War Gods of the Deep is a shambling finale. The production barely pulled together, and was a clear sign that without Corman, and after so many years of the dead refusing to stay buried, the life had finally gone out of them. Jules Verne admired Poe, though, so he might have been mildly entertained by a gothic scientific romance inspired by them both. Though not fine cinema by any stretch of the imagination, American International's Poe series is chilly, lurid drive-in fun, and one of history's most consistent efforts in adapting the great American author, more or less. It also constitutes the most consistent effort by an American studio to produce a body of work of the caliber of Universal Studios' monster films, or at least its latter B-movie phase. It makes a very satisfying cinematic experience to pick up with American International's Poe films right where Universal Monsters leaves off. The spooky stuff is all there and all in order. The movie begins with an exhumation in an eerie frog. The movie begins with an exhumation in an eerie, fog-enshrouded cemetery,